Some interesting news out of a more recent interview between Donald Trump and the Nelk Boys. He says he is going to be doing the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Let's take a listen.
You're doing a lot of podcasts recently. One that I would love to see you on is, I think Joe Rogan has to have you on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you do that?
Oh, sure, I would.
I think Joe, like, besides us, Joe's
I think
obviously-
I'm doing it, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So you are going to do Joe Rogan?
Yeah, I am.
Joe Rogan's the best in the game for sure. And I think, you know,
Did Joe become so well known because of the UFC? And he does a great job with that, right? What was it that made Joe the best?
During COVID, you know, he was very outspoken on all the corruption going on during COVID. And I think that's personally when I started watching him a lot too. And just, he's an honest guy too, right?
He is.
So I think.
Good guy.
Good guy. And I think you guys together would just
And he's got a good voice. That's important.
You gotta love the Nelk guys being like, besides us, he's the biggest. Come on, bro. Also, I just can't get over that. That's incredible. That is a very inflated picture. I guess I'll just put it that way. Yeah, also, a little bit interesting that he was like, well, in 2020, during COVID, that's when I became aware of him. I'm like, well, he was already the biggest podcast in the world in 2019, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do get the sense Trump really has no idea of this fear. Like he's you know, people in his world are like, oh, you should do this one, you should do that one, but I don't feel like he's himself consuming this content.
He doesn't consume it.
Yeah.
But here's
a very cable news still
Here's
guy.
at least what I respect about Trump and his campaign, at least around this, and especially with the candidate, because there's not enough politicians who can do this, where he'll have staff who are like, or advisors, Dana White in particular. Dana's friends with the Nelk guys. I'm assuming that's how a lot of this happened. But Dana will just be like, hey man, these are really big. And Trump is like, oh really? And he's like, okay. It's like one of those where he is fully aware that these are very influential, and he understands that it has some major impact in terms of reaching people. The reason why we wanted to highlight this, if it's true, by the way, I have no inside knowledge or anything. I haven't asked Joe. He had previously said he didn't necessarily want to have Trump on, not out of anything personal, but because he didn't want to have like the major political candidates. Maybe he's changed his mind. I know he's made some comments recently. He's like some things that I would like to ask Trump. He previously had Bernie Sanders on in the 2020 campaign. But the reason why this is important is it really does highlight the strategies, both Trump and Harris, that call back to the Call Her Daddy appearance by Kamala Harris. Let's put this up there on the screen from Axios. Sarah Fisher, she's a really good media reporter, and she wrote this up, which is the podcast become politician magnets. And what she highlights is just the obvious trend to probably anyone who's watching this show, but hasn't yet like sunk in for a lot of people, is just how much podcasts, and specifically like shows like ours or a million others that are out there, have become the dominant consumption of not just political content, but of all content, and that is the best way to reach people who are under the age of 35. So if you look within here, what they talk about is not only the Call Her Daddy appearance that Kamala did, and by the way, there were some stupid analyses done. They were like, oh, look, Kamala Harris's Call Her Daddy appearance on YouTube wasn't that big. I'm like, guys, Call Her Daddy is predominantly an audio podcast. They get 10 million listeners, the second largest podcast in the world behind Rogan. I would not diminish the influence of that just from knowing the pop culture influence of it itself, the amount of merch she sells and all the other stuff. But Trump, I mean, if you look at the other ones that he's done recently between All In, Lex Friedman, Theo Vaughn, Logan Paul, this is all a major young male strategy. I mean, Rogan has talked about this before. He said his like audience is like 90-something% men. I'm willing to bet that's probably the same case for like Logan Paul, for Theo Vaughn, for both of those. I mean, these are comedy podcasts. They're very like male space. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, by the way. But it's just one of those where it shows you how, in particular, if you think about the podcast demo, and actually UFC is a good analogy to this. The UFC is not only like, I wouldn't call it explicitly right-wing, but it's got a very right-wing audience. But if you've ever been to a UFC fight, that's the multiracial or male working class. If you want, I'm serious. You look around, you see people from all over the world, black, white, Hispanic. WWE is very much the same way. They have a huge black Latino fan base as well. Like that is what he's going for. And that's why, you know, part of the whole like black Latino conversation that frustrates me is that they don't ever focus in on the gender gap. So actually in that NBC poll that we led our show with, if you look at the crosstab, Trump's male numbers are the highest level since any candidate since Ronald Reagan in 1980. The female number is actually like relatively static. It's more about movement within the female demographic in terms of like white men or white females and, you know, Latino females or whatever. But with men specifically across all races, especially with Latino and black men, that is where the most movement is happening. I mean, Trump, I would not put it past Trump to win nearly 50% of the Latino male vote in 2024. That is crazy compared to where it was in 2016, where it was like roughly in the 30s. So that is how I see the podcast move more than anything. Both, and the choices of them, Call Her Daddy, and then a lot of these male-dominated podcasts, like Nelk Boys, you know, for example. Who do you think is watching that? You know?
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. And Rogan is like, you know, the crown jewel of the brosphere.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and it's interesting too, like if this is real, which like you said, it hasn't been confirmed, and Lord knows Trump can make some shit up on the fly. Definitely. You never know, right?
And he did attack Joe not that long ago.
So. Did he?
Yeah, remember? We covered it. He was like, he's like, Joe Rogan is a lightweight or something like that. He said that he gets booed. They're like, he's going to get booed at UFC.
Yeah, because what? Joe said something critical of him and he got in his feelings about it. Was something like that,
said,
right?
Like, I think he said, I think Kamala is going to win.
Or maybe he said she did a good job in the debate. Was that what it was? I don't know.
It was so stupid, but anyways,
But I mean, it's also interesting because Joe previously did not want to interview Trump because he feels like I'm a comedian. Like, I don't know if I'm really the person to interview. I'm not a journalist, right? And because this mode of politics has become more normalized, it's possible he feels more comfortable. Like, oh, well, if the friggin' Nelk Boys can interview him, like, you know, I could probably do a better job than they. At least I'll ask him something that might be a little bit challenging. But, you know, it's no secret also why both Kamala and Trump and any other politician loves this realm, because Kamala knows she can go on with Alex Cooper and Call Her Daddy and just like, you know, not get asked a single difficult question. Yeah. Trump knows damn well when he's sitting down with the Nelk Boys that it's all going to be just like friendly banter and games. And so, you know, this is also part of a strategy to avoid really having any challenging questions. And I think it does pose some difficult ethical issues for people who are comedians, who are cultural figures like Alex Cooper, like Andrew Schultz or whatever. It's like, you know, it still remains that ethical quandary of, okay, I'm not well studied in the Middle East and the history of the Middle East and what's going on with this conflict. I'm not well studied in these areas. Do I feel like it's a responsible thing for me to, you know, to interview this incredibly powerful person who is vying for the highest office in the land? And I do think I think it's a tricky thing. I think it's a difficult thing. But the more that it becomes normal and, you know, typical within a campaign, first of all, the more politicians are going to lean into it because it's nothing but a win for them. They get to go on and get asked softball questions and have clips that go viral and reach a demographic that's important to them. And, you know, it also obviously serves the interest of those podcasters who get to have a big guest, and all the incentives are in the opposite direction of asking difficult questions and actually, you know, challenging any of these political candidates.
Yeah, the good news is I mean, Joe's had previous skepticism about that, about having politicians on in the past. So, and he actually can be a sleeper when he wants to be, like in terms of undercutting or be like, what do you mean by that? And like really pressing. Some of his best moments of deconstructing somebody really just come from like a very skeptical face and probing. So I would hope to see a little bit of that. But look, it gets to, you should not be going into that being like expecting like a NBC News like Meet the Press interview. That's not what they're going for either side. It literally is not a job. So yeah, I think it's a difficult question, but like you said,
you don't want to end up just being like a propaganda piece.
Right.
Like I think about this, you know, if I get asked to go on Fox News because I said something critical of Democrats, and they're like, just say that, don't say the thing that you know is critical of Trump. And so, you know, I'm leery in those situations of just getting used to make like a propaganda point for their own purposes. And so I think you have to be concerned about that as well, even if you are just like a, you know, a cultural phenomenon like an Alex Cooper or whatever, because she did get just turned into like a propaganda piece for Kamala.
I think she's kind of fine with it.
I think she is too. Yeah. But I mean, you know, that's what you did, girl. Yeah. Like you did an infomercial for Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
And maybe you're good with that. That's fine. But you know, I saw backlash even from her audience of like,
Yeah.
not super happy that was the use of the platform.
I don't disagree with you. Look, I think at this point, he at least can see what the other people have either done right or wrong. What was the best strategy? I still think the Schultz strategy was the best one, just treat him like a normal guest. And if he were Trump's superpower in all interviews, he just talks and talks. He likes to control the conversation, especially doesn't like follow-up questions or anything like that. I mean, look, this is his media training from years and years. He knows exactly what he's doing. So getting around that is going to be the most difficult thing. That can be a plus or minus in a 3.5, 4-hour podcast. So the time is actually probably the most important. One of the things that politicians do is they almost never agree to a 3-hour interview. They usually do like 1 hour. Trump can do a 1-hour interview all day long. I've interviewed Trump 4 times. Almost every single time was nearly 1 hour. And trying to control that, he knows exactly like when to allow a follow-up or when not to. And it can be quite difficult, to get in there. So time is going to be critical. Asking like a follow-up question or any of that. Something I think Joe and actually even Schultz and some of the other people like Lex and all those did is they asked something which Trump is not necessarily used to, and that's whenever you would get interesting answers. So, for example, like Lex, I remember being like, "So how, what do you think about bringing people together?" And Trump was like, "I'm not interested in that." Basically, it was like,
yeah.
And he's like, "Well, the left, they're radical, they're Lex was like, "Yeah, but what about bringing people together?" That's not even a question I would ask, just because I would like to focus on policy. But I was like, for a lot of people, the way they think about politics, and even if the way they think about Trump per se, they're like, that's probably something I don't really like about Trump. And so for him, whenever he gets asked about that and his answer, it can be quite revealing. That's kind of what I would expect to come out from a Joe Rogan podcast with him. Because, Rogan is always like, look, I'm not going to, he's not a technical expert or something, but he tries to cut to the core of like what this person is all about. And I would be curious to see Trump in that spirit, especially whenever he can't necessarily rely on old tricks. And then it's up to Joe on how he wants to direct the conversation.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting.
And I mean, Joe likes to play dumb sometimes.
Yeah, but he's not.
He's not. Joe is an intelligent, well-read person who, has a lot of thoughts and ideas on a variety of subjects. I guess I would just say, as politicians find this terrain to be more fruitful for them and increasingly lean into it over like traditional media spaces, which makes all the sense in the world given the direction of media spheres, it actually does put more of an onus on the podcaster to study up and think about what issues actually impact people and ask them difficult questions, since they're apparently the only ones who are going to have the opportunity to. Now, the downside of that for them individually is that means they'll never get that interview again. But, is that really the end of the world? Because I think no matter who you are, whether you're a comedian or cultural figure or a singer or a lifestyle wellness guru or whatever the hell you're doing, right? You still have, if you accept that interview, you still have some responsibility to try to probe what are the actual positions of this individual, what is the way this individual actually thinks. You don't just get a get out of jail free pass because you are not a journalist. You're a sentient human being. You're obviously intelligent enough to have, created this successful platform. And so I do think because they're leaning more into this strategy, it creates more of a responsibility on these podcasters to try to rise to the occasion.
Well, that's the funny part. I remember him saying that in the past. He's like, I don't want to do it because I don't want that responsibility.
Yeah,
he was like, I never wanted to be in a position where I had to be like checking people's facts and making sure that what's saying somebody is not true. He's like, we used to just smoke weed and get drunk on this podcast and talk shit. And eventually it became like a platform or something. So I totally understand where he's coming from. And if he doesn't even want to do it, I get that too, especially in the position that he's in. I mean, you think about it. You got CNN running articles about you and all this other stuff. Like, that's a nightmare, especially from what he wants to do is do his show, and he's got an amazing club, and he just wants to go there every night and hang out with his friends. I totally sympathize with that. So we'll see. I'm curious. As you said, Trump could just be talking. He could be like mouthing off for what he wants. And at this point, he's done a decent number of these Rogan Sphere type interviews.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll see if it happens.
Yeah.
I also want to see the time thing. That's actually probably the most important.
Right. Does he give him the full?
Bernie Sanders?
Does he give him the full 3 hours or at least 2.5?
It's gotta be long. Yeah.
Yeah. I
that's
think Bernie.
the key.
I want to say Bernie was like 2.5. That's my guess.
It was actually 107.
Wow.
107.
Really?
That's very short.
That is short.
Very short.
Yeah, that's too short.
Yeah.
I guess the last thing I'll say is this has been a very concerted strategy, especially from the Trump campaign. Like Kamala has done some of these things, but this has been a more concerted strategy from the Trump campaign. And it really is targeted at young men, which are some of the least frequent voters.
Literally.
So, you know, they're betting a lot on turning out a group of voters. And they're betting more on this strategy than they are like a traditional field strategy in that, you know, typical campaign, like we're going to have offices all over the state and we're going to go and knock on your door and whatever. They're leaning more into this. In some ways they have to because they don't have nearly as much money as the Harris campaign does. But also I think it is a tactical, you know, belief that this is more effective at this point than that traditional door-knocking campaign. And, you know, there may be something to that. They may be correct about that, and they certainly see these as, like, friendly spaces with people who are potentially open to him. So, you know, we're going to find out if those infrequent male voters, young male voters, do, in fact, turn out for him on Election Day, because he's betting a lot on that.
Yeah, it's very much a dudes rock campaign, and I'm curious to see if it works. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.